The Sinister Tenant. Jane hadn't expected much when she moved to the small forgotten town of Crestwood. She needed a change, a place far from the memories of a failed relationship and a dead-end job. The ad for a roommate seemed perfect, an affordable apartment in an old crumbling building. It was a chance to start over. But as she walked into the dimly lit hallway of the dilapidated complex, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a mistake. Her new roommate, Emily, had seemed normal enough when they met. A bit quiet maybe, but friendly in that offhanded way people in small towns often were. Emily had lived in the apartment for years, far longer than Jane thought anyone would want to. The building had an aura of decay, peeling wallpaper, water stains on the ceiling, and a pervasive dampness that clung to everything. But Jane told herself it was just old, nothing more. The first few weeks passed uneventfully, but Jane began to notice strange things almost immediately. The temperature in her room would drop suddenly, her breath visible in the icy air. The faint scent of rotting meat would waft through the apartment at odd hours, vanishing as quickly as it came. Small objects disappeared only to reappear in odd places, sometimes covered in a thin layer of grime. Emily, however, seemed unfazed by it all. She never mentioned the strange occurrences, and when Jane brought them up, she brushed them off with a dismissive smile.
Old buildings make weird noises,
she'd say, or, "You're just not used to the place yet." But there was something in Emily's eyes, a flicker of fear maybe, or knowledge she wasn't sharing, that set Jane on edge. One night, after a particularly long and grueling day at her new job, Jane came home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. The lights were off, the only illumination coming from a single flickering candle on the table.
"Emily?"
Jane called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" Emily didn't respond at first, her gaze distant. Then slowly, she turned to face Jane, her eyes hollow as if she were staring straight through her. "He's coming," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Jane froze.
Who's coming?
Emily blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and forced a smile.
No one. Just a bad dream. I'm fine.
But Jane knew better. That night, the temperature in the apartment plummeted, and Jane awoke to find her room coated in a thin layer of frost. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed something scrawled on the wall opposite her bed, in what looked like blackened blood. "He is here." Panicked, she rushed out of her room to find Emily standing in the hallway, her eyes wide and frantic. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "Now!" But it was too late. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Jane could feel a presence, something cold and evil lurking just out of sight. The air grew thick, suffocating as an oppressive silence descended. Emily stared blankly, as if seeing something in the veil between ours and another world. Jane felt a hand, icy, skeletal, brush against her arm, and she screamed, backing away into the wall. The presence grew stronger, closer, and Jane could feel it pressing against her. In the flickering light of the candle, Jane saw the figure of a man standing just behind Emily. He was tall, impossibly thin, his skin stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around him. He grinned, revealing rows of sharp, rotting teeth. Emily turned to face the figure, her expression resigned.
"I tried to stop him,"
she whispered to Jane,
"but he's too strong."
With a swift motion, the figure reached out and grabbed Emily by the throat, lifting her off the ground. Emily didn't struggle. Instead, she looked at Jane with a mixture of fear and sadness. "Run," she mouthed, before the figure squeezed, crushing her windpipe with a sickening crack. Jane bolted for the door, but it was locked shut. The figure dropped Emily's lifeless body to the floor and turned its gaze on Jane. It moved toward her slowly, deliberately, its bony fingers outstretched. Desperate, Jane grabbed a chair and swung it at the figure, but it passed through him as if he were made of smoke. The figure laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling in a dead wind, and continued its approach. Jane's back hit the wall, and she realized with growing terror that there was nowhere left to run. The figure was inches away now, its foul breath washing over her like a wave of decay. It leaned in close, its lips brushing against her ear. "You're mine," it hissed. Jane felt a cold, invasive presence seep into her mind, her thoughts growing fuzzy and distant. The figure's grin widened as it tightened its grip around her soul, feeding on her fear, her despair. Jane's vision darkened, her strength fading, until all that remained was the hollow echo of the figure's voice in her mind. The next morning, the apartment was silent. Emily's lifeless body lay cold on the floor, her face twisted in a final expression of terror. Jane's room was empty, the bed neatly made as if she had never been there at all. Days passed, and eventually the landlord came to check on his tenants, concerned after not hearing from them. When he opened the door, he found the apartment eerily quiet, with no sign of Jane or Emily. After a time, the apartment was put back on the market, and soon enough, a new tenant moved in, unaware of the dark history that lingered in the walls, hungry for its next victim. The roommates. Michael Carter walked down the vibrant streets of New York City, his leather jacket draped over his shoulder. The city was alive, neon lights reflecting off the wet pavement, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had just toured an incredible flat, a spacious, upscale apartment in a historic brownstone, right in the heart of Manhattan. But the real attraction was the 3 stunning women who lived there. Alice had been the one to greet him at the door, her blonde hair cascading in soft waves down her back. Her bright smile and playful eyes drew him in instantly. Jenna, the raven-haired beauty, handed him a glass of red wine with a smile that promised secrets. Julia, the redhead with a mysterious air, stayed back, her piercing gaze following his every move.
"Welcome to our little paradise,"
Alice had purred, leaning in closer than necessary. Her breath was warm against his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. I think you're going to fit right in. Michael couldn't believe his luck. 3 beautiful women, all living together and inviting him into their world. It was like a fantasy come true. He imagined the late-night conversations, the flirtations, and perhaps more. Without hesitation, he agreed to move in. The first few weeks felt like a dream. The girls were intoxicatingly beautiful, their charm inescapable. Alice was always touchy, her hands finding reasons to brush against his arm or his thigh. Jenna was more direct, her eyes lingering on his lips, her smile suggestive. Even Julia, with her reserved demeanour, had moments where her cool exterior melted away, revealing a sensuality that was impossible to ignore. The tension in the apartment was palpable, a constant undercurrent of unspoken desire. Michael often found himself in close quarters with one of them, Alice pressing herself against him as she reached for something in the kitchen, Jenna's fingers trailing along his arm as she passed by, Julia's gaze locking with his, promising something darker, something dangerous. But there was something else too, something beneath the surface that made Michael uneasy. The apartment seemed to hum with a strange energy, the air thick with something he couldn't quite place. He began to notice odd things. A door slightly ajar when he was sure he'd closed it, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. But every time he tried to voice his concerns, one of the girls would distract him, pulling him into their orbit, making him forget everything but the moment. One evening, after a few too many glasses of wine, Michael finally asked about the previous tenant. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the lightness in the room vanishing as the girls exchanged glances.
Paul,
Jenna said slowly, swirling the wine in her glass, her eyes dark with something unspoken. He had to leave.
Personal reasons.
Alice's hand slid up Michael's arm, her touch sending a shiver through him.
Such a
shame, she whispered, her voice a low purr.
He was a lot of fun.
Julia's gaze was fixed on him, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease. As the weeks passed, the tension only grew. Michael found himself drawn deeper into the girls' world, unable to resist their allure. They seemed to take turns seducing him, each one more intoxicating than the last. Alice would appear in his doorway late at night, her body silhouetted by the dim light, as she offered him a drink and a lingering touch. Jenna's eyes would follow him, her lips curling into a smile that promised more than just a kiss. Even Julia, who had remained distant, began to let her guard down, her touches lingering longer, her smiles growing more seductive. But with the pleasure came fear. Michael started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He heard whispers through the walls, voices he couldn't quite make out, and footsteps that stopped just outside his door. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. One night, the unease became too much. He decided to confront them, to find out what was really going on. He waited until the house was quiet before creeping out of his room. As he approached the attic door, he noticed a soft light spilling out from the cracks. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open, revealing a scene that sent a jolt of terror through him. The attic was filled with candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the center of the room was a large bed, draped in crimson silk, the sheets rumpled. The air was thick with the scent of wine and something else, something metallic and foul. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around to find Alice, Jenna and Julia standing there, their expressions no longer warm or inviting. Their eyes gleamed with something dark, something dangerous. Curiosity killed the cat, Julia whispered, her voice low and sultry as she stepped closer, her hand trailing down his chest. Michael's pulse quickened as he tried to back away, but they were on him in an instant, their hands roaming over his body in a way that was both sensual and terrifying. They pushed him onto the bed, their fingers tracing patterns on his skin that burned like fire. He struggled to break free, but their grip was ironclad, their strength far beyond what he had imagined. What are you doing? He gasped, his voice trembling with fear and something else, something dark and twisted that stirred deep within him. We need you, Alice purred, her lips brushing against his ear, her breath hot on his skin. Jenna's hand slid down his chest, her fingers digging into his flesh as she leaned in close, her lips inches from his.
We need what's inside you,
she whispered, her voice a seductive hiss. Michael's vision blurred as the air around him seemed to thicken, his body growing heavy. The girls began to chant, their voices blending into a single terrifying sound that echoed in his mind. He felt his strength draining away, pulled into the darkness that surrounded him.
What are you?
His voice barely a whisper. Julia's lips brushed against his as she leaned in, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. We're collectors, Michael, she whispered, her voice a mix of seduction and cruelty. And you're our latest prize.
Why me?
He choked out. Alice leaned in and whispered the final chilling words he would ever hear.
Because you were easy.
As the last of his strength ebbed away, Michael realized with dawning horror what they had been doing all along. They weren't just seducing him, they were feeding on him, draining his life force with every touch, every kiss, until there was nothing left. His final thoughts were of their smiles, the warmth he had once believed was genuine, now revealed to be nothing more than a facade, a trap designed to lure him in. As darkness claimed him, the last thing he saw was their faces, twisted into expressions of pure evil, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a job well done. When Michael's body was discovered, the cause of death was listed as a heart attack. The girls played their roles perfectly, their grief convincing, their tears genuine. No one questioned them. No one suspected a thing. The apartment went up for rent again, and soon, another unsuspecting tenant moved in, charmed by the 3 lovely women who welcomed him with open arms. And in the attic, the bed was cleaned, the candles relit, and the ritual prepared. After all, the girls weren't just collecting souls, they were consuming them, and their hunger was insatiable.
Bloody Mary's Horror Stories. Watch, like, and subscribe.